What if the most dangerous thing a spy ever carried into enemy territory wasn't a weapon, wasn't a radio transmitter, wasn't a forged passport, it was a pair of hands? Hands that had spent 18 months learning exactly how much pressure to apply to a pulled muscle. Hands that could feel tension in a body before the person carrying it even knew it was there. Hands that, by 2003, belonged to a woman crossing into Damascus with a folding massage table, a bottle of cedar oil, and a name that wasn't hers. Her name was Lara Haddad. Lebanese-born, Beirut-trained, referred by a diplomat's wife she had met at a wellness event in Amman. That's what the file said. That's what the border officer's system returned when he ran her documents. That's what the colonel's wife believed when she made the appointment. None of it was true. And the part that terrifies you, once you understand this operation fully, is that the lie didn't come in from outside. It walked through the front door. It set up a table in the living room. It asked how your back was feeling and whether you'd been carrying too much stress lately. And you told it everything. Damascus, in 2003, was a city that had learned to watch strangers. The Assad government's intelligence apparatus, the Mukhabarat, operated through layers: military intelligence, political security, Air Force intelligence, internal security. Ordinary Syrians knew the rules. You didn't speak openly, you didn't trust easily, you especially didn't trust outsiders. But there is a category of person that suspicion struggles to fully process. Not the diplomat, not the businessman, not the foreign journalist. Those people were watched as a matter of course. The category that slips through isn't a threat profile. It's a service provider. Someone who comes to your home because your wife's lower back has been acting up. Someone whose presence is not explained by geopolitics but by a referred phone number and a reputation for good work. Mossad had identified this gap years before the operation began, not through any single brilliant insight, but through patient, unglamorous analysis of how Syria's senior military class actually lived. Officers in the upper ranks didn't socialize outside their community. Their wives moved within tight, vetted circles. Outside contractors who entered these homes, electricians, cleaners, were screened. But the screening was designed to catch political threats, ideological threats, not wellness professionals referred by a general's wife to a colonel's wife over lunch. The gap wasn't in Syria's security architecture. It was in the assumption that threat had a recognizable shape. The woman who would become Lara Haddad had been working for Mossad for several years before this operation. Her file, according to sources familiar with Israeli intelligence practices, described her in terms that aren't typical of operational assessments. Not brilliant analyst, not exceptional marksman. The phrase that appeared more than once, across multiple evaluations, was something closer to, "She makes people feel they already know her." That quality is rare. It is also, in deep cover work, almost impossible to train. You can teach language. You can teach tradecraft. You can teach a cover story until it lives in muscle memory. You cannot teach the specific human frequency that makes a stranger's nervous system relax in your presence. She had it naturally, which is why she was chosen. And which is also why, 8 years later, the operation's cost would be so hard to calculate. She was given a full Lebanese biography, a childhood in Akrafi, a school with records that would survive a basic check, a father who had died of a long illness, a detail chosen deliberately, because deceased parents discourage the kind of follow-up questions that living ones invite. She was given documentation, a phone number with a Lebanese origin trail, a referral pathway that had been quietly constructed over 2 years through a businesswoman who had no idea what she was helping build. And she was given 18 months of actual massage therapy training. Not a crash course. Not enough to fake it. Enough to be real at it, because the cover would be tested not by a security officer with a checklist, but by women with chronic back pain who had been using therapists for years and would know within the first 10 minutes whether this person's hands were genuine. The cover had to be real enough to pass human scrutiny. which meant it had to, in significant ways, become real. That decision, to build a legend so deeply that it acquired actual substance, was operationally sound. It was also the first seed of a problem no one in the planning phase fully mapped. When a cover becomes real, putting it down is no longer just a procedural step. It's a loss. The entry into Damascus's military social world came through the referral chain Mossad had spent 2 years quietly constructing. The first appointment was not with a general's household. It was with the wife of an Air Force colonel, a man several rungs below the primary targets, but positioned within the social orbit that mattered. The appointment was in April 2003. She arrived with her table and her oils and her cover story sitting lightly on her like a coat she'd been wearing long enough that it had conformed to her shape. She worked for 90 minutes. She said very little. She listened to the kinds of things people say when their body is finally relaxing. Small complaints about household stress, a comment about a husband's schedule, a mention of a dinner they'd attended the previous week with another family. She filed all of it. Not in notes, in memory, which is harder to intercept. She was invited back the following week. By the third appointment, she had the colonel's wife's trust, not the deep, tested trust of years, but the preliminary trust of a person who has found someone competent and discreet. By the fourth appointment, she had been mentioned to a friend. By the end of the summer, she had been referred to 2 other households. One of those households was connected to a major general in Syrian military intelligence. The operation had taken 2 years to build and 1 referral to activate. That ratio, 2 years of preparation for a single human moment, is not unusual in deep cover work. What was unusual was how cleanly the entry had gone. No friction, no questions that required improvisation. The colonel's wife had accepted Lara Haddad exactly as presented, and had then done Mossad's expansion work for them by mentioning her to friends. It had gone almost perfectly. And that, in intelligence work, is its own kind of warning. There were 2 risks no one in Tel Aviv could fully monitor from a distance. The first was linguistic drift. Arabic is a language of region and family and neighborhood. Dialects carry biographical information the way fingerprints carry identity. Lara Haddad was supposed to have grown up in Akrafie. The operative's Arabic was strong, her Lebanese dialect convincing, but dialect is a living thing. It shifts with experience, and the longer she spent in Damascus, around Syrian Arabic, the more her speech would be exposed to pressure. A word chosen slightly wrong. A cadence that didn't fully match the biography. Small things. The kind of things no security service would catch in a single meeting, but that a woman who had been talking to you for 3 years might eventually notice without being able to name what she'd noticed. The second risk was harder to manage because it wasn't linguistic or procedural. It was emotional. The access model for this operation required genuine human warmth. You cannot be a trusted presence in someone's home for months without extending some portion of real attention to that person. And real attention, over time, creates real attachment on both sides. The operation needed her to be close enough to these women that they would speak freely in her presence. That closeness could not be fully performed. It had to be, at least partially felt. Which meant that somewhere in the space between the operative and the cover, there was a line that would become harder to locate the longer the operation ran. No one in the planning phase could tell her exactly where that line was. They could only tell her not to cross it. She was 3 appointments into a Damascus general's household. She had been referred to 2 more families. She had access to a social world that Israeli intelligence had been locked out of for years. And somewhere in a residence in Meze, a major general's wife had just told her friend that she should really try this Lebanese therapist. So good, so warm, you feel like you've known her your whole life. What none of them knew, not the colonel's wife, not the general's wife, not anyone in those households, was that the woman they were recommending to each other had no idea yet how deep she would go, or what it would cost to come back. By late 2004, Lara Haddad had become a fixture in 3 Damascus households. Not a visitor, not a contractor. A fixture, the kind of person whose absence would be noticed, whose arrival was anticipated, whose opinion on minor domestic matters was occasionally sought. She had become, without any single dramatic moment marking the transition, trusted. This was the operational goal. It was also the point at which the operation became genuinely dangerous, in a way that the planning phase had underestimated. Because trust in a closed community doesn't stay contained. It spreads through the same referral networks that had brought her in. Each relationship she built became a credential for the next one. The colonel's wife had vouched for her to the major general's household. The major general's wife mentioned her to 2 other families. By early 2005, she was moving through a social world that connected, through varying degrees of proximity, to 8 separate senior military figures. She had not sought this expansion. It had happened because the cover was working, and a cover that works too well creates a different kind of exposure than one that's failing. The intelligence yield in this period was significant. Not dramatic single-source revelations. Intelligence rarely works that way, but the kind of granular, contextual information that fills gaps satellite imagery and signals intercepts leave open. She heard about tensions between 2 generals whose public relationship appeared cooperative. She learned scheduling patterns when certain officers were at their compounds, when they traveled, who was present at informal gatherings that never appeared in any official calendar. She overheard a conversation, not targeted, between a general and his aide about an infrastructure project in eastern Syria that Israeli analysts had been attempting to assess for over a year. She reported all of it through the communication protocols she had been given. Dead drops, coded messaging, the occasional face-to-face with a handler who met her in Beirut during the regular trips back that Lara Haddad's cover story required, a Lebanese woman maintaining her life in Beirut while working periodically in Damascus. The trips to Beirut were load-bearing for the legend. They gave the cover geographic consistency. They also gave the operative the only stretches of time in which she could fully step back from Lara Haddad and exist, briefly, as herself. Her handlers noticed something in these debrief meetings by mid-2005. She was precise. She was productive. She was delivering material that was meeting and occasionally exceeding the operation's stated collection targets. But she was also asking questions that operatives in healthy psychological condition don't typically ask at this stage. Not about tradecraft, about the people. She wanted to know whether the intelligence she was providing was being used in ways that would harm the families she had access to. Whether the generals whose households she was entering were personally targeted, what the collection would be used for. These were not unreasonable questions. They were also not the questions of someone who had maintained clean operational distance from their targets. Her primary handler noted it, reported it. The assessment at the time was that it represented normal psychological stress from sustained deep cover work, manageable, not disqualifying, something to monitor. The assessment was probably correct. It was also, in retrospect, the first visible evidence of something the operation had not fully accounted for, that after 2 years of being Lara Haddad, the woman underneath that name had begun to feel the weight of what Lara Haddad's relationships actually were. The fracture point came not from external pressure but from a specific relationship that had developed beyond what the operational model had anticipated. One of the general's wives, a woman in her mid-40s, educated, perceptive, with a son studying abroad and a husband who was absent more than present, had developed a genuine friendship with Lara Haddad. Not the polite warmth of a client who appreciated good service, something more substantive. She called between appointments. She shared things that had nothing to do with physical complaints. She treated Lara as a person she had chosen, not just a service she had hired. The operative had been trained to cultivate exactly this kind of relationship. What she had not been trained for, what training cannot fully prepare you for, was what it feels like to be on the receiving end of someone's real affection when you are entirely false to them. She reported this relationship to her handler with clinical accuracy. Access levels, topics discussed, intelligence value of the proximity. All correct, all professional. And then, at the end of a debrief in Beirut in late 2005, she said something that her handler documented and that reportedly circulated in a limited form among the senior officers managing the operation. She said, "She trusts me the way you trust someone you've chosen, not the way you trust someone who was referred to you." That took time. I don't know what to do with that. Her handler told her what she already knew, that the relationship was the operation, that the trust was the access, that sentiment about the quality of someone's belief in you was not an operational variable. She nodded. She flew back to Damascus. She kept the appointments. The abort discussion happened in early 2006, and it was initiated not by the operative but by her handler, based on a risk assessment that had been building for several months. The concern was not that she had been identified. There was no indication of that. The concern was subtler, that the operation had expanded beyond its original parameters in ways that were creating compounding exposure risk. She was now accessing 7 households. The referral network had grown organically to a point where Lara Haddad was a known quantity in a social world that was, by definition, surveilled. The more people who knew her name and recommended her and spoke about her at dinners, the more surface area the cover had. And surface area, in intelligence work, is vulnerability. There was a secondary concern the abort discussion didn't name directly, but that was present in the room. She had been running this cover for nearly 3 years. The psychological toll of sustained deep cover work is documented. Operatives and long-running legends sometimes begin making micro-decisions that prioritize the cover's human relationships over the operational objectives. Not consciously, not as betrayal. As a slow gravitational drift toward the world they've been inhabiting, away from the world they actually belong to. The recommendation was a controlled wind-down, a 6-month extraction arc. Lara Haddad would gradually become less available, busier, a possible relocation back to Beirut. A natural fade that wouldn't trigger questions or create the kind of sudden absence that might prompt someone to make inquiries. The operative argued against it. Her argument was operational, not personal, or at least that's how she framed it. She had recently been referred to an 8th household. The husband was a general with a role in Syrian military procurement. The access she was developing there had potential intelligence value that the operation had not yet had a chance to assess. A wind-down now would abandon that access before it had been evaluated. The argument was sound. It was accepted. The extraction arc was postponed. Here is what the operations planners believed at this point, in early 2006, that the cover was intact, the operative was performing, the intelligence yield justified continued exposure, and the psychological stress was within manageable parameters. All of that was true. What was also true, and what the assessment did not capture, was that the decision to continue had been made partly on the basis of the operative's own recommendation, and her recommendation had been framed operationally, but it had emerged from a situation in which she had been Lara Haddad for 3 years, in which Lara Haddad's relationships had acquired genuine weight, and in which the prospect of those relationships ending, of the cover fading and the people believing in it being left behind, was not a purely abstract consideration for her anymore. She had argued for the operation's continuation. The argument was professionally valid. It may also have been something else, and she may not have fully known which it was. In the summer of 2006, a new family entered the network. The wife of a senior general in Syrian military intelligence, one of the primary collection targets the operation had been designed, from the beginning, to reach. The referral came from the general's wife, whose friendship the operative had been navigating for over a year. She had told her friend that Lara was exceptional, discreet, trustworthy. The word she apparently used, according to what the operative later reported, was safe. She told her friend that Lara Haddad was safe. The operative took the appointment. She set up her table in a new living room in Mezza. She introduced herself. She began the session. She was now one referral away from the center of what this operation had always been about. 3 years of groundwork had led to this room. The cover had held. The access was real. The intelligence waiting in this household, in the schedules and conversations and patterns of a military intelligence general's domestic life, was exactly what Tel Aviv had built this operation to reach. She should have felt the operation clicking into place. Instead, she felt the weight of the woman in the next room, the one who had called her safe, and understood for the first time with full clarity that the word meant something to that woman that it could never honestly mean coming from her. She didn't know, yet, what to do with that understanding. She began the session. The first session with the military intelligence general's wife lasted just over an hour. The woman was guarded in the way people are guarded when they've been told, implicitly or explicitly, their whole lives that the wrong word in the wrong room has consequences. She spoke carefully. She asked more questions than most new clients did, not hostile questions, observational ones. Where had Lara trained? How long had she been coming to Damascus? Did she have family here? The operative answered everything cleanly. The cover held its shape under the questions the way it had been built to. But she noticed something in the room that she reported to her handler afterward with more detail than the session's intelligence yield seemed to warrant. The general's wife was watching her hands. Not with suspicion, with attention. The way someone watches a person they are deciding about, cataloging small things, building an impression. It was the behavior of someone who was, herself, careful about who she allowed close. The operative noted it, filed it, told her handler the access was developing but slower than the other households, recommended patience over acceleration. Her handler agreed. Standard guidance: let the relationship build at its natural pace. Don't push. Don't create the kind of sudden warmth that feels performed. What neither of them discussed was the more pressing question the first session had raised. This woman was the wife of a Syrian military intelligence general. Her husband's professional function was, specifically, identifying threats. His household would not be a soft target. His wife, whether formally trained or simply shaped by years of proximity to that world, was not going to open the way the colonel's wife had opened, or the way the major general's wife had, through ordinary social warmth and the pleasure of finding someone competent and discreet. This access was going to require something the operation had not fully planned for. Not more patience, more depth, and more depth meant more exposure. The false start came in the third session. The operative had identified, through careful listening across 2 appointments, that the general's wife had a specific anxiety she hadn't named directly, something connected to her son, who was at a military academy and about whom she spoke in a tone that carried more weight than pride alone. The operative made a judgment call. She created a small opening, a comment gently placed, about how difficult it must be to have a son in that environment. So much pressure, so much expectation. The general's wife went quiet, not the quiet of someone considering whether to speak, the quiet of someone who had noticed a door being opened and was deciding whether the person who opened it had done so on purpose. She changed the subject. She asked about Lara's schedule, whether she had other clients in Damascus or mainly in Beirut. The session ended shortly after. The appointment the following week was canceled. No explanation given. The operative reported this to her handler as a probable overcalculation. She had moved too quickly, created a moment that felt engineered. Her handler agreed. The near-abort discussion that followed was brief but pointed. If this relationship had been spooked, if the general's wife had sensed anything constructed about the exchange, the risk wasn't just losing this particular access. The general's wife was connected, through the referral network, to the woman who had recommended Lara Haddad as safe. A damaged impression here could travel backward through the network and destabilize relationships that had taken 3 years to build. The recommendation was to wait. Do not follow up. Let the canceled appointment sit without response and see whether the general's wife reinitiated contact. 2 weeks passed. 3. The operative continued her other appointments, maintained her other relationships, said nothing about the silence. On the 23rd day, the general's wife called and rescheduled, and she didn't acknowledge the gap. She asked whether Lara had any availability that week, in the same neutral tone she might use with any service provider she had briefly lost track of. The operative said yes, confirmed the time, kept her voice exactly as it needed to be, present, unhurried, carrying no relief. She had passed something. She wasn't entirely sure what. The incorrect assumption that shaped the next 6 months was this: the operative and her handlers both concluded that the general's wife had withdrawn because she had sensed calculation in that single moment, and had returned because the long silence had reassured her that no follow-up pressure was coming. The read was that she was cautious but not suspicious, that the relationship could be rebuilt slowly on her terms. This read was wrong. Not entirely, but in a way that mattered. The general's wife had withdrawn because her husband had told her to. Not about Lara Haddad specifically. He had told her during a period of elevated security awareness that the operative had no visibility into, to reduce her social engagements temporarily. Routine precaution during a sensitive operational period for his department. She had returned to the appointments not because the silence had reassured her, but because the security period had passed and her husband had said nothing further about it. The operative was reading a human dynamic, a woman's personal caution, a relationship recalibrating. The actual dynamic was institutional. She had been granted continued access not through relationship management but through a Syrian general's internal security calendar. She didn't know this. Her handlers didn't know this. The intelligence stream from this household, which began developing meaningfully by late 2006, was built on a foundation of access that had been granted for reasons the operation never correctly identified. Everything that followed, every session, every overheard detail, every small piece of the general's household pattern that fed back to Tel Aviv, was real intelligence gathered through a relationship whose stability rested on a misread. The false release moment came in the spring of 2007. By then, the relationship with the general's wife had developed into something that resembled the other relationships in the network. Regular appointments, a degree of personal warmth, conversation that occasionally drifted beyond the transactional. The operative had stopped feeling the elevated alertness of the early sessions. The room had become familiar. The woman had become, in the flattened way that familiarity produces, readable. One afternoon, near the end of a session, the general's wife said something that the operative initially received as confirmation that the cover was fully secure. She said, "You know, my husband asked about you." The operative kept her hands moving, kept her breathing even, asked, in the mild tone of someone only moderately curious, what he had asked. The general's wife said he had asked how she'd found her, who had referred her, how long she'd been coming to Damascus. Standard questions, she said. He asked about everyone, he couldn't help it. She laughed when she said it. A small, familiar laugh, the kind a wife produces when describing a husband's professional habits following him home. The operative laughed with her, said it must be exhausting, being married to someone who never fully switches off. The general's wife agreed, said he had seemed satisfied with her answers, said he had even said she should keep the appointments, that it was good for her to have something consistent. The operative filed this as a past security check. The general had inquired, received normal answers through his wife's account of a normal referral, and cleared the relationship. The access was not only intact, it had been, in some informal sense, approved. She reported this to her handler with measured confidence. The raid was, "This household is secure. The general's review of her presence has concluded without concern. Collection can continue." Her handler accepted the assessment. What neither of them processed carefully enough in that moment was a different question. Not whether the general had been satisfied by his wife's answers, but what it meant that he had asked at all. A Syrian military intelligence general who inquires about his wife's massage therapist and then says, "Keep the appointments," is not necessarily a man who has been reassured. He may be a man who has decided that watching is more useful than stopping. The operative felt the room settle, felt the relationship normalize, felt, for the first time in months, that the operation was on stable ground. She was wrong about what the stability meant, but she didn't know that yet. She confirmed her next appointment. She packed her table. She walked out through a courtyard where a general's household staff moved around her with the comfortable indifference reserved for familiar faces. She had never been more visible. She felt in that moment almost invisible. That gap between how exposed she was and how safe she felt was the most dangerous place the operation had ever been. The general stopped asking about Lara Haddad after the spring of 2007. His wife mentioned this once, offhandedly, as though it were a minor administrative update. He'd moved on to other concerns, she said, the way he always did. The operative received this information and logged it as continued clearance. The household remained on her schedule. The sessions continued. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know until years later through channels she no longer had access to, was that the general had not moved on. He had simply moved the inquiry somewhere she couldn't see it. A quiet word to a colleague in a different directorate. A request to run a background trace on Lebanese nationals entering Damascus on recurring visitor patterns. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that would disturb the surface. He was a patient man. His profession had made him that way. The operative kept her appointments through 2007 and into 2008. The intelligence yield from his household remained productive. The other relationships in the network continued to generate material. From a collection standpoint, the operation was performing. The abort discussion of 2006 had receded into the background, superseded by results. But results in intelligence operations have a way of accumulating risk the way debt accumulates interest, quietly, structurally, in ways that don't announce themselves until the total becomes unmanageable. The first consequence that couldn't be contained came from a direction the operation had never fully modeled: the referral network itself. By 2008, Lara Haddad had been a known quantity in Damascus's military social world for 5 years. 5 years of appointments, of referrals, of being mentioned at dinners and recommended over phone calls. The cover had succeeded so thoroughly that it had produced its own problem. She was too established to fade without explanation, and too embedded to exit without leaving a visible hole. A normal service provider who stops being available generates mild inconvenience. A trusted presence in multiple households who disappears generates questions. And questions in a community shaped by Syrian military intelligence culture don't stay social for long. They become something more systematic. The extraction window that had been identified in 2006 and postponed had not grown more manageable with time. It had grown narrower. Every additional month of successful operation made the eventual exit more structurally complicated. The operations planners had understood this abstractly. They had not fully reckoned with what it meant in practice, that by 2008 there was no clean way out. There was only the question of which kind of messy exit was least damaging. The Civil War changed the calculation before the exit could be executed on Mossad's terms. By 2011, Damascus was fracturing. Military families were relocating. Some officers were being deployed to active theaters. The social infrastructure that had sustained the cover, the referral networks, the household routines, the consistent schedules that made a recurring Lebanese therapist's presence unremarkable, was dissolving under pressures that had nothing to do with the operation. In one sense, this was operationally convenient. The cover didn't need to be formally retired. The network was dispersing on its own. Lara Haddad could simply become unreachable, and the chaos of the period would absorb the absence without generating the kind of focused inquiry that a peacetime disappearance might have prompted. But the general whose household had been the operation's primary target was not dispersing. He was, if anything, more active, his role in the Syrian military expanding as the government mobilized against the uprising. The access the operation had spent years developing was, at precisely the moment it might have produced its most significant intelligence, being wound down. The timing was not a failure of planning. It was the nature of operating inside historical events that don't pause for collection windows. But it meant that the operation's most valuable potential yield, access to a senior military intelligence figure during a period of active conflict, was never fully realized. Years of work, positioned perfectly, retracted at the moment of maximum relevance. The message came in the summer of 2011. The general's wife, not the primary target's wife, but the woman who had become the operative's closest relationship in Damascus, the one who had called her safe, sent a message through the channel she had always used to schedule appointments. She said she needed help. Her husband was being deployed. Her children were frightened. She had heard things she didn't want to repeat over the phone. She asked whether Lara could come to Damascus, or whether there was somewhere they could meet. The operative's communication infrastructure was already being wound down. She was operating in the final phase of extraction. Her handler's guidance was unambiguous. No contact, no response, clean break. She did not respond. The woman sent 2 more messages over the following weeks, then nothing. This is where the operation's cost stops being strategic and becomes something harder to categorize. The intelligence that the operation produced was real. The access was genuine. The material fed back to Tel Aviv over 8 years informed assessments, filled gaps, and contributed to a body of knowledge about Syrian military decision-making that could not have been assembled through technical collection alone. None of that is in dispute. What is also not in dispute is what the operation required to produce those results. It required a woman to spend 8 years being someone she wasn't, to build relationships she couldn't honor, to receive trust she couldn't deserve, and to exit without explanation from people who had no framework for understanding what had happened to them. The general's wife who had called her safe had done so because she believed it. She had used her own credibility, her own relationship to open a door for someone who was, in every way that mattered, using her. She never knew that. She sent 3 messages into silence and eventually stopped. That silence is not a classified outcome. It doesn't appear in any operational assessment. It has no intelligence value. It is simply what happened to a woman who trusted someone who had been built, specifically and professionally, to be trusted. The operative returned to a life she had been partly absent from for 8 years. The psychological debrief process for long-running deep cover operations is extensive. Mossad, like all serious intelligence services, understands that operatives who have inhabited false identities for extended periods require structured reintegration. The process is thorough. It is also, by the accounts of people familiar with it, somewhat beside the point. Because the problem is not that the operative doesn't know who she is. The problem is that she knows exactly who she is, and she also knows with equal clarity what she did, not as an abstraction, but as a series of specific human moments. The appointments, the conversations, the afternoon she helped someone get medical care they needed, the morning she laughed with a woman about a husband who couldn't stop being a general even at home. Those moments are not erased by debrief. They are not reclassified. They simply exist permanently in the same memory that holds everything else. She could not return to Damascus. She could not explain the silence to anyone still waiting for an answer. She could not separate with any clean line which parts of 8 years had been the operation and which parts had been her, because the operation had required her to bring herself into it fully enough that the distinction had, in places, dissolved. This is what sustained deception costs, not in the dramatic sense of a cover that blew or a mission that failed. In the quieter sense of a person who performed a version of themselves for 8 years that was real enough to generate genuine relationships, and who now has to carry the weight of those relationships with no legitimate way to hold them. The operation closed. The files were archived, the intelligence was used. Somewhere in what remains of Damascus's military social world, there are women who still remember a Lebanese therapist named Lara Haddad. Warm, discreet, the kind of person you recommended to your friends because she made you feel, somehow, that you already knew her. They don't know where she went. They probably don't think about it often. But if you asked them, they would tell you she was trustworthy. They would mean it. And they would be the last people on Earth qualified to judge. If this kind of operational history interests you, the decisions that don't make headlines, the costs that never appear in mission files, subscribe to Hidden Ops. New documentary every week.